Hi everybody, welcome to Bicep 101. My name's Alex Frankel. I spoke yesterday. I'm a PM on the what we call the Azure deployments team. So we cover Bicep, which obviously we'll talk about today, but it's also the same team that supports Terraform, and my team, the Terraform folks are represented obviously at this conference as well. And you heard Mark and I speak yesterday if you attended the State of IAC session. But today we get to just dive in right from the beginning and learn Bicep from scratch. So we'll walk you through basically what you need to know to kind of be productive if you want to use Bicep after the session and at work. So I already introduced myself, so I'll skip over that. It's going to be demo heavy, but I just have a couple of slides that I want to get through. So spoke about this a little bit yesterday in the State of IAC session, but want to get into a few more details on why you would pick Bicep in particular. The first is that Bicep is declarative. So we used the cake analogy a couple of times yesterday. Declarative just means what, not how. You just say what you want. You don't have to describe how you get there. The cake analogy being you say, I want a birthday cake. You don't have to follow the recipe of first you mix the flour and then the sugar and the blah, 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 and then you get a cake. You just ask for a cake and you get a cake. The second is that it's goal seeking, so you don't need to worry about getting the dependencies right. You don't need to worry about checking existence or any of those sorts of things. Because it's goal seeking, you just say what you want at the end of this execution, and it's Bicep's job to kind of figure out all the details of what needs to happen to kind of make it so. If you're familiar with concepts like desired state configuration in PowerShell, there's a lot of similarities between the two kind of methodologies. The next is day zero support. We didn't talk too much about that yesterday. So what day zero support means is as soon as a new resource type or a new API version of an existing resource type is available in Azure, it's instantly usable in Bicep. So there's no onboarding process that you need to go through to make it usable in Bicep. It's just a very thin abstraction over the ARM APIs. So that just means that as soon as something's available, you can use it, which is great for, if you're bleeding edge and you want to use the newest, latest, and greatest resource types. But where it's particularly important is if you're using new API versions of resource types that you've already adopted. So if a new version of virtual machines or a new version of web apps or a new version of container apps is released, it's instantly usable in Bicep. There's nothing that we need to do to make it available. And then the last is great tooling, and hopefully you'll get to see what that means as part of this session. But we really, really care about tooling to make sure that you're getting great validation, great IntelliSense, just sort of great help at all aspects of your authoring process and your deployment process to make sure that your deployments are as likely to succeed as possible. And what we see in the telemetry that we're able to look at on the Azure side is that Bicep has a very, very low error rate of the actual deployments, and that's because we are catching a lot in the editor or before the deployment starts in what's called the pre-flight validation phase, which we'll talk about a little bit more. So great tooling is really part of our ethos of what we're building and kind of how we're operating. And that's it really for slides. The rest is going to be demos, so I'll switch over in a second. But I just wanted to call out, please interrupt along the way. I'll repeat the question so that the recording gets it, but this is better if it's interactive, so please don't hesitate. If you have any questions about what I'm doing at all, please do stop me, just raise your hand and we'll be able to do that. So let's switch over to VS Code. And we're going to start from a blank file. I have a little markdown cheat sheet, which I'm planning to publish on GitHub after this. It has links and all sorts of good stuff as well. Let me make this a little bit bigger, but let's just get right into it. So how do you set up your development environment is kind of the first thing that you need to do. There is a dedicated Bicep extension in VS Code. It's also available in Visual Studio if you prefer to author stuff there. So you can go and grab this extension and install it, and that's all you need to do. Everything else is taken care of. I promise this is not 3.8 stars. It's just my window is getting cut off. It's more than 3.8 stars. Okay. So first things first is we're just going to declare a resource, a vanilla resource, no frills, no nothing. So the first keyword we're going to look at is resource. And then the next thing that you need is what's called the symbolic name. It's just a variable reference. So you could call this foo, you could call this whatever you want. We're just going to call it app plan because we're going to create an app service plan in Azure. That's what we're going to start with. And then immediately I get some completion support. So I'm already starting to get help from the editor. So let's start typing server farm. So app service plan in the API itself is actually called server farm. If you're in the portal, you'll see a different name, but when you're working with Bicep, you are working with the APIs directly. So there are some of those things that you'll need to think about is what is the actual name in ARM versus the name in the portal. So we'll click server farms, and then the next question I'm getting asked is what API version that you want to use. Generally speaking, you can always pick the latest stable API version. Sometimes you'll see dash preview on some of these API versions, and it depends on which resource type you're working with, but generally speaking, pick the latest and you're probably just fine. And now that we know an API version, we just say equals, which is what we want the resource to actually look like, and then I get more help. So now I'm getting asked what are the required properties that I need for this resource. And I just need a few things here. There's a few more properties that I will need. So my name is going to be Alfran app plan. My location is going to be, I could just say, West US 2 here. But I'm actually going to say use an expression because Bicep supports all sorts of language expressions. So I'm going to say resource group.location. And then kind, I'm going to set this to Linux. And then properties. And you'll notice here that I get IntelliSense for all the individual properties as well. So for each resource type, we have a type definition to go with it. And every resource type has this properties bag available to it. And within that, we're just going to select one property. We're going to say reserve true. This is just kind of a funny part of the API. You need to set this in order for it to be a Linux-based app service plan. And now this is enough. This is actually a deployable artifact. There's a variety of different ways that you can deploy Bicep files. So you can deploy with the CLI or PowerShell. You can deploy with the portal as well if you want to copy and paste the code. You can also deploy right from within VS Code. You can just either right-click on the Bicep file, and I apologize that this is so small, but you can say show deployment pane to the side. And I'll minimize this here for a second. And this is actually kind of an integrated deployment experience right in VS Code that makes everything pretty easy and pretty on rails. As long as our internet is sufficient, it's going to ask me which subscription I want to use. We'll just give it a second. So it asked me what subscription, and now it's asking me for what resource group. So I'm going to say the PSDO resource group that I've created. It's asking if I want parameters. There are no parameters. So at this point, I can deploy right away. I can also validate. So I mentioned the pre-flight API. So what we can do with a Bicep file, and this is especially relevant if you have 100 resources in your file, we can look at all the code up front and validate it as much as we possibly can. So what we actually do in this case is we'll take the resource definition and we'll send it to the resource provider. So we'll send it to the web resource provider and we'll say, hey, we're about to create this resource type. To the best of your understanding, is this going to succeed? And they can check things like quota availability in the subscription. They can check, in the case of networking, IP ranges. They can check all sorts of things that we don't have the capacity to check. So pre-flight is one of those things that Bicep has the ability to kind of broker with the resource providers that ultimately leads to your code being more likely to succeed at the end of the day. It's not a guarantee that it will work, but it's checking more upfront than if you were to not check those things. Now that it is validated, I can actually go ahead and deploy. It's going to start spinning here. It's going to start listing out the different resource types. This is a link to the actual deployment in the portal. which can be helpful to look at everything kind of live in Azure, and there's links for everything in there as well. So we'll give this a second to load up. And we got an error, so this is good. Parameter skew cannot be null, I agree. So we need to define a skew. Ideally, that would have been caught in pre-flight, but that just means that the resource provider isn't checking that particular property. So let's go here and skew name, and I just need to double check that I'm getting the right skew here. Skews B1. B1. And when this finishes up, I should be able to redeploy. Let me X out of this. Show deployment pane one more time. And let's deploy. While we're waiting for this to finish, just to get a pulse from the room, is everyone in the room using Azure today? And how many people are using ARM templates today? Anybody? Anybody using Bicep already? Okay, a few people. And for those that are using Azure and not using ARM templates, are you using PowerShell modules to deploy? Is that kind of typical? Okay, got it. Cool. So let's take a look at this deployment. Fighting the internet here. Let's see how we do. Okay, that one succeeded. So we'll look at what's going on in the portal in a second, but now let's move on. So next on my agenda is to start covering some more advanced Bicep features. These are pretty basic for most of your Bicep files. You are going to want to have a hard-coded Bicep representation here. You're going to want this to be more dynamic. So one of the crucial things you'll see in essentially every single parameter file or every single Bicep file are parameters. So parameters are just the param keyword. So I might say here name prefix, and I'll say the type. So name prefix is going to be a string. I can leave this as is, or I can set a default value. So just like in PowerShell, I can set a default of name prefix of alfran. And then I immediately get some help from the editor here that the parameter is declared, but it's never used. So let's start to use it. So what I'm going to do here is Bicep supports string interpolation. All I'm going to do here is insert the name prefix parameter here, and now I have my app plan with the same name prefix, but now this is a little bit more dynamic. Similar to parameters, I can declare variables. So variables are the var keyword. Variables are assigned once and never change. So it's just essentially a code block that you want to use multiple times in your file. So if I wanted to replace the SKU name, I could have a SKU name here, B1. And this is purely a code cleanliness thing. So if you have bigger objects or things of that nature that you want to encapsulate in a variable so you can keep your resource definition a little bit cleaner, you can do those sorts of things with variables. And then the last kind of basic keyword that you'll see a lot are outputs. So let's say output app plan ID. So if I need the app plan ID, again, this is typed, so I'm going to say string here. And I'm just going to say app plan, the symbolic reference, dot ID. And you'll see here that I can return all sorts of properties, and I get IntelliSense and I get completions throughout all of this. So I'm just going to select the ID here. And now I have a slightly more dynamic Bicep file here. And if I go to the deployment pane again, now I get parameters represented here. If I wanted to change the name prefix to something else, I could replace that. But I'll just leave this as alfran, and I'm not going to do another deployment at this point. Let's declare one more resource. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to just grab it here from here. And I have a few more parameters here, so I'm just going to fill this in. Param web app name. Actually, let me just grab these from the file here. Let's not waste any time. Okie doke. And I just need to resolve one of these references here, so applan.id. This line, line 25, you'll see a lot in Bicep. So a lot of what you're doing in Azure is you're wiring different resources together. In Bicep, we make this pretty easy. So in this case, I need the server farm ID. And just like I grabbed it with the outputs, I can grab applan.id. And instead of actually manually authoring the entire resource ID as a string or using the format function to express this resource ID, I can just do simple referencing like in most programming languages, and this is good enough for what I need. So that's kind of the basics of authoring your resources, using parameters to make them dynamic, and to wire those resources together, which is things that you'll see in pretty much every Bicep file that you have. The next thing that we're going to talk about is modules, which is really, really common. Different than PowerShell modules. Modules in Bicep is a way of separating concerns within your Bicep project. Modules can be remote, they can be local. We'll walk through some of that in detail. But before I keep going, any high-level questions, anything I can answer about anything we've seen so far? Yeah?
Is Bicep, so here we're establishing in the web app that there's a dependency on the app plan. Is that just happening behind the scenes?
Great question. So that's exactly right. So Bicep does automatic dependency management. And the way that it does that, if you've used ARM templates in the past, you actually had to say, this needs to come first, and then this needs to go second, and so on. And that was a source of all sorts of pain and all sorts of errors. But because of this explicit reference to the symbolic name, that applan.id, that's how we make the association that, okay, if this website wants to exist, it needs this reference to this app plan, and therefore the app plan must exist. So that from there, we can construct the kind of dependency graph of all the things that need to happen in order for this website to exist. This works great in the simple case. It's especially helpful in the case where you have a lot of different resources. One, for making sure that your dependencies are correct, and two, for executing the deployment in as parallel a nature as possible so that you can deploy as fast as possible. So we'll take care of all of that for you. Everything's parallel by default unless there's some sequencing that needs to happen, in which case we take care of that too. Yeah.
I have a slight follow-up to that.
Sure.
I've played with Bicep for some things with my job. There's also a depends on, is that correct, in Bicep? How does that differ from the implicit depends on?
Great question. So the question was, I said I would repeat the questions. The question was, why is there a depends on property if there's already kind of automatic dependencies happening? The reason for that is there are particular cases where there may not be this explicit reference to another symbolic name, but that still needs to happen in sequence. So kind of a canonical example in Bicep, there's this capability called a deployment script, and it allows you to execute a PowerShell script or a bash script inside of a deployment file. Often you're doing things inside of the script that you need dependencies on. And so you might explicitly say, hey, don't do anything until this deployment script is done, in which case you can actually set the depends on property manually. And it's just an array of resources. So you could say app plan here, and it would do the exact same thing. And actually, Bicep is telling me, hey, this depends on is unnecessary because I already know that there's a dependency between these resources, so you can delete this, and the quick fix should just remove it on my behalf. Yeah, any other questions? Okay. So the next thing we'll talk about is modules, and these are also extremely common in pretty much every project that you're going to see. So let's rename main.bicep to webapp.bicep. And now let's create a new main.bicep. And we're just going to reference that as a module. So the next new keyword is a module. And just like a resource, it has a symbolic name. So a module will say web app deploy. And then it's going to ask me which bicep file that I want to reference. So I can just reference webapp.bicep. And same thing here. It's going to ask me for what properties are required. In this case, all these parameters have default values. So to declare the module and consume it, this is actually valid because there's nothing else that I need to fill out. I'm essentially saying, hey, execute this other bicep file. If I were to, for example, delete this default value, I'm immediately going to get an error. And the error is going to say, hey, this module is missing a required property. It's missing parameters because you haven't provided that parameter anywhere. So in this case, I'm going to insert params. And if I do required properties, it's going to ask me for the name prefix. And then I can just set alfran here, and everything resolves. So just like that, I'm able to simplify my project quite a bit by having a bunch of small bicep files, a bunch of separation of concerns, and then I can stitch it all together with modules. And we'll continue to take care of dependencies and all those sorts of things. Everything kind of just works. Yeah? I'll pay you $5 later because that was a perfect segue. So the question was, if I want modules shared in some external location, is it possible to do that? And the answer is yes. So there's one option, but there's kind of two ways that manifests. So one is we have a public registry. So similar to the PowerShell gallery, we publish a bunch of modules as Microsoft that you can consume directly. So that's what we call the public registry. And then you can create your own private registries. So you can stand up your own registry. The way that is done is you create an instance of Azure Container Registry. So you can create that in Azure, you can use it as is, and you can start publishing your Bicep modules there. It's actually the same technology that PowerShell is now using to back the PowerShell gallery, or at some point that will be done. I don't know, I'm looking at Michael because he knows all the details, but that transition is happening where PowerShell modules are using what's called OCI artifacts under the covers, which essentially you're using a container registry as a generic storage mechanism. So that's what PowerShell gallery is using to store modules. That's what Bicep is using now to store Bicep modules as well. So it's essentially just a dumping ground for whatever you want to use. Go ahead, Michael.
There's a session on Thursday on that topic.
And there's a session on Thursday on that topic. So let me show you what a remote module reference looks like. So we have a local module reference here, but if I want to reference something from an external registry, let's say virtual network. So here's my local Bicep file, but then there's some other options here. So BR stands for Bicep Registry, which is what we were just talking about. TS stands for template specs. So in Azure, there's a way to publish an ARM template or a Bicep file as a resource where you have separate RBAC capabilities in Azure. So you can actually reference those as well as modules, but most of the time you'll see BR or BR/public. BR is just the scheme, and then public is an alias to the registry. So this public maps to mcr.microsoft.com. This is just shorthand to make this easy. And then at this point, I get completions for all of the different modules that are available publicly. All the ones that we publish are under the moniker AVM, so Azure Verified Modules. These are modules that are tested, they're version controlled, they have a whole process behind them. They're very reliable, they're good for taking a dependency on. So I can start filtering through this list. So if I say AVM, there's two types of AVM modules. There's pattern, which is PTN. This is composition of several modules altogether, several resources. But the ones that we're going to start with are res. So avm/res, which is a single resource. And then we're going to go with network, and then virtual network. And then at this point, I get asked for what version of the module that I want to use. Just like I said, these are all done with semantic versioning, so they publish breaking changes. And then once I've selected the version, it loads that up and will start giving me completions for these modules as well. So I can just do required properties. I can give the name of the VNet, my VNet, and then I can do my address prefix. So this would be like 10.0.0/16, something of that nature. Oh, but I'm getting this wrong. Oh, this needs to be in an array. So you're seeing Bicep's type safety helping me along the way. This is a classic example. If I was using ARM templates, I would get an error and not realize it until the end. So address prefix, I think I need an object here. Array of one or more IP, okay, so this is just the array. So I'll just do 10.0.0.0/16, and in that way, this validates I can start consuming this module. I'm not going to get into publishing net new modules to a registry today, but we'll share documentation for how that is done. So this is a reference to a local module. This is a reference to a remote module. Both are totally viable. So if you exist in like a central team in your company and you want to publish golden modules for your organization, a private Bicep registry is a great way to do that and to distribute that reliably. Any other questions? Okay. Next, I think we're doing Bicep params. Oh yeah, there's a couple of additional language capabilities that I did want to highlight. So there's two that are pretty common. One is conditions. So if you want to do something simple like conditionally deploy depending on input parameters, you could say param deploy web app. And you would just say this is a Boolean. Let's default it to false. I can actually set a condition on the whole module, or I can set a condition on the resource. So if I wanted to say if deploy web app is true, then deploy the web app. So that's how conditions are expressed. Obviously, if this was set to true, it would deploy. If it's set to false, it will not deploy. And then the second capability that I wanted to show was loops. So let's say you don't want just one web app, you want 10 web apps. You can use the for keyword or the for expression to actually declare that. So the way this looks is you add an opening square bracket and a closing square bracket, and you could say for item and items. So let's create a variable here called items, and let's give it a property, just name. Oh, let's do so I might have name Alex, and then I might have name Angel. And so in this way, I can now describe multiple resources to be declared all at once. I'm getting an error here saying that something is not recognized, but I think what's that? Colon after items. You're exactly right. Thank you. So instead of Alfran here, let's just make the name prefix item.name. And in that way, now I can deploy and get several of these web apps instead of just one. So that's loops. It's pretty straightforward. You can do all sorts of arrays and array math. There's Lambda functions inside of Bicep. So there's actually quite a lot of expressibility where you can do a lot of list manipulation and list work if you're creating several subnets or networking rules or RBAC assignments. Really, you name it, you can do all sorts of things here. And then I wanted to show Bicep params. So a lot of times you'll see here. I'm going to delete this for a second. And I'm going to delete this here. Let's just go back here. Okay. So if I have my parameter name prefix here and string, what you'll often want to do instead of filling out all of your parameters every single time you deploy, you're going to want to set up a file for setting up and managing your parameters on a regular cadence. So for that, we have this file called Bicep params. Let me just actually reference this parameter right here. And we're going to create params.bicep param. So this is a net new file type, and the first thing that it's going to ask me for is to actually reference a specific Bicep file. So I'm going to use the keyword using, and it's going to start asking me, okay, what file do you want to tie this Bicep param file to so that I can actually validate your code on an ongoing basis. So I'm going to say using main.bicep, and it's going to say immediately, hey, you're missing a parameter here. If I do param here, it's going to ask me, okay, you need this name prefix parameter, and then I can just set it to alfran, just like I had it in the other file. Beyond just setting up this initial wiring of Bicep params and Bicep, there's a validation happening of every single parameter here too. So if I wanted to say, introduce some constraints on this parameter, which is something that we're used to in the PowerShell world as well, I might say something like min length or max length for this parameter. So if there's naming conventions or naming restrictions on the length of a resource name, I may want to restrict the length of your parameter name here. So I'll say the min length is 3, and I'll say the max length is 24. These things with the @ are called decorators. There are decorators on parameters. There's decorators on resources and modules as well. There's kind of a whole ecosystem of decorators that you can explore in documentation. But decorators in this case are just restricting what the parameter is allowed to express here. So now there's extra validation that's happening on the name prefix. So let's say if I just said AB, I'm going to start getting validation at this point that the parameters has a value of a length of 2, but it needs to have a length of 3. So when I go to alfran, this all works out and everything sort of gets checked. Just like I was deploying here directly from the Bicep file, I can right-click on the Bicep param file and show the deployment pane to the side. And same deal, it's going to look at the parameter file, and it's already going to establish this Bicep params reference here that I can't highlight, unfortunately, but it's just telling me that the deployment pane is bound to this Bicep file and Bicep param file, and I can pick the scope just like before. Any other questions on what we've seen so far? Okay. We'll keep going because we have some more time here. So one other thing I do want to show is obviously I can deploy with the deployment pane, but I can also deploy in PowerShell. So if I wanted to deploy this as a PowerShell command, it's new AZ resource group deployment, which completions will surely help me with in a second. See resource. Oh, I do need to get into PowerShell before I do that, huh? That helps. There we go. Resource group deployment. And then it's going to ask me for my template file, at which point I can just reference the main.bicep file directly. And I can also reference the parameter file. Again, main.bicep param. And that should be everything I need. But let's see if there's anything here. Oh, and I need the resource group name. And this is just PSDO Alfran. And that's all that I should need to actually get this going. So I can deploy this. Can I find path? Bicep param. Oh, params.bicep param. So I'll get that going, but it's the same idea. So you have a lot of different options for deploying bicep files, whether it's as a PowerShell module locally, or you could wire this up into a pipeline, also with PowerShell. There's dedicated GitHub and Azure DevOps actions for deploying bicep files, so you kind of have the full gamut of what you would need to do to actually deploy these files. The next thing that I want to show is you'll notice that everything that we're doing so far is deploying to the resource group scope. So by default, when you're deploying a bicep file, it assumes everything that you're doing is into a specific resource group. But you can actually deploy to any other scope in Azure. So beyond just resource groups, there's subscriptions and management groups and even tenant. The way that you deploy to a different scope is with the target scope keyword. So let me show that here for a second. So if I wanted to deploy this at a subscription scope for a second, we'll just say the target scope right up here at the top of the file is subscription. And again, Bicep is going to be here kind of validating everything for me. It's saying, hey, you're trying to deploy a resource group, but it's set to the wrong scope. So now it's saying the specified module declaration is missing the following required properties scope. And the scope in this case, we can take a look at it. The scope property needs a reference to the scope that you want to deploy to. So because we're deploying to subscription, we need to say essentially which resource group scope that we want to deploy this to. So I'm going to use the resource group function. And in it, I'll say the reference is to the same resource group that we've been using, PSDO Alfran. And from there, everything just works out the way it's supposed to. So you can target multiple resource groups in a single deployment. If you want, you can actually deploy your resource group and the resources to that resource group in a single file. So we could do something like resource RG. I can start looking for resource groups here. This just needs a few required properties. So if I want the resource group to be named PSDO Alfran, and the location to be West US 2. Because this is declarative, because this is goal seeking, even though this resource group already exists, we don't need to care that it already exists. We're just going to reach the same end goal state that we wanted to at the beginning. And now instead of doing a manual reference to this resource group here, I can just say RG. And everything is now wired together. The dependencies are wired together. And I can just deploy this in one shot. So instead of creating the resource group manually at the beginning and then actually deploying my Bicep file, I can just have one Bicep file that deploys the resource group to the subscription and then actually deploys the resources, in this case, the web app, to that resource group. Yes?
Can you deploy across subscriptions?
Yes. So the question was, can you deploy across subscriptions? The answer is yes. So if you wanted to set, for example, the target scope one level higher, you could set the target scope to be management group. is one way that you could do it. Oops. And from here, you can start to target subscriptions. Or if you leave it here as subscription, you could have a module. So let's just create a blank module here, foo.bicep. And let's create another resource group for the sake of RG2. It's asking me to set the target scope to subscription because it knows that resource groups are only valid at subscriptions. And now when I go back to main.bicep, I can do module, other RG, and then I'll do foo.bicep. There's no parameters required here. And if I want to deploy to a different subscription, I can use the subscription function. And then this would be my subscription ID. And at that point, you can target whatever subscription you want. Either you can go from one subscription to another, or you can start from a management group and target a particular subscription from there. Any other questions? Sure.
Can you speak to a little bit of, we've seen a lot of the validation that we get for free by not just using the extension, but using Bicep. Can you touch on how that's gonna just continue to improve over time thanks to Preflight and us getting the different resource providers to add more checks to their validation code?
Yeah, so the question was, how is Preflight and Validate getting better over time? So if I'm referencing all these resource types, what are they doing to improve the validation so that my Bicep code is more reliable? So we work with all the resource providers to make sure that their validation implementation is checking as much as it possibly can. So in that example that we just saw where the SKU was missing from the resource declaration and I got an error only after the deployment started, that's a perfect example of something that could have been caught earlier. So we can now go to that resource provider and say, hey, can you add this to your pre-flight implementation? Hopefully they do that. They add that to their pre-flight implementation so that in future cases, if someone's ever missing a SKU, they can start to check that up front and we don't have to start the deployment in order to do that. Good question. Anything else? We just have 2 more minutes, so I am going to wrap up here with just a couple of things to hopefully leave you with more that you can look into to get deeper in your Bicep experience. So there's just a couple of links here that are important to cover. One is the Bicep docs. So this is aka.ms/bicep. We have really rich documentation that walks you through really everything that you need to see here. So the concept section is particularly good. That's why we open it by default. Basically, for every keyword that exists in Bicep, we have documentation on it walking you through what it is with examples and so on and so forth. There's so much here that we didn't get to cover. There's importing capabilities if you're going to pull in functions from other files or types from other files. There's a type keyword here, which should be represented. Yeah, user-defined data types, so you can define new data types that you can use in your Bicep files or provide them to other projects through the import keyword. So there's a lot of richness here to look into. There's also there's a video learning path on YouTube, so you can watch really for every key document that we have in documentation. There's a video to go with it that will walk you through all the steps that you need to kind of start learning more about that specific detail in Bicep. So the documentation here is really, really good. I encourage you to take a look at it. The next is Azure Verified Modules. So I can just go to ak.ms/avm. This walks you through all the different Azure Verified modules that are available. There's nice videos here as well walking you through how you consume them, and then all the different resource modules, pattern modules, and utility modules for AVM. So that's all represented here as well. And then the last thing here is the Bicep community. So ak.ms/armnews. You can sign up here. you will start getting invites for our community call is the big piece when you sign up here. So we do community calls once a month where we'll bring up just kind of whatever new stuff, whether it's demos or new releases or new capabilities or feedback that we need from all of you in the community. You can sign up at the link here and you'll start getting regular invites to our community call. That's everything that I need to cover. I'll double check my slides. The last thing here then is there's 3 more Bicep sessions. So there's one on Wednesday doing a deep dive on Azure verified modules as well as a few other concepts that are related like landing zones. The next session is the Bicep deep dive where we're going to go deep on topics like deployment stacks, which we didn't cover today, extensibility, so being able to use Bicep not just for Azure resources, but for Entra resources to create groups and service principals and things of that nature. And then the last session is Bicep and CI/CD. So if you want to take your Bicep code and add it to your CI/CD pipelines, Sydney Smith, who many of you in the PowerShell community are familiar with, is going to be walking through how you connect it to GitHub Actions, as well as Azure DevOps, and the tasks that we provide to make that really easy. So that'll be, I think, the last session on Thursday at 2:45. We'll go into depth there. Before I wrap up, any last questions that I can answer for anybody? Okay, well, thank you very much. Really appreciate you guys attending.